time for another round of Brandy. Candid conversations over cocktails about all things brand with your hosts, Reilly Newman and Scott Saunders, the brand developers behind Motif Brands.
Welcome back to another round of Brandy. On today's episode, we're talking about something that affects all of our lives, but very often we don't see it as brands, and that is no other than music. And Scott brought this forward because he texted me and was like, every band really does have a brand to it. And he really wanted to lean into some of these classic, very iconic brands.
Like bands in the past that have done it well.
Oh,
and if you look at, and I think what brought this up is, again, when a small business is bringing itself onto the market for the first time, it has to bring presence, and we talk about having all the components of brand clarity and what they stand for, and connecting with their audience and building that audience, but having a consistency and a really focused approach.
Yeah.
And it made me think of I grew up, my childhood was growing up in the 70s and 80s, and so I, at such a young age, was influenced by bands that did it so well, that took branding to the next level. The first one that comes to mind is the band Kiss. And, they came out in 1973. And they were one of the first bands that really, created such a memorable word mark for their band. And from the launch of it, basically has never changed. And they weren't the first to have like a logo mark, that type of thing. I mean, you look at bands before Elvis. Yeah, we're talking about mega superstar bands. And prior to that, bands that were like Beatlemania and all that stuff. But every album would come out, and their approach and the name and the title of the album, the artwork was different. It was conceptual. It was thing. Grateful Dead came out with their classic Skull with the Lightning Bolt, but that was in 1969, I think. Late 60s, even though they'd come out in the mid 60s, that when that iconic to this day, that the red and blue and the lightning bolt, that's iconic.
Yeah.
So Kiss wasn't the first, but in my memory, Kiss was one of the first ones that really did it well, where they almost even their band members were branded. They created personas, and I know their big gimmick was the makeup, and no one for up until the early 80s when they came out with the Unmasked album, when they finally revealed what the actual band members looked like. Was paparazzi was always trying to catch pictures of what they look like without their makeup. No one knew what these guys really looked like, and it created this stigma. And even, and I know I'm dating myself, but I think it was first grade when I remember, seeing posters of the Kiss members, and it took rock star to another level because there were personas, there was the
mystery.
And so many bands followed, and really, I think if you look at the history of like band logos, it was like I think 1976 when things really blew up. That's when AC/DC established their famous word mark. Other bands were coming out with.
When was Led Zeppelin?
Led Zeppelin was before that, but even then, like their iconic. Some of what they consider their current logo mark wasn't what they had in the iteration. You look at, they went to a scripty kind of like font for, I think, Zeppelin 3. And like every album, again, had a different flavor. But even creating logo marks, when Van Halen came on the scene in 1977, their classic VH became this symbol. I remember, sitting in class, and again, this is before your time, but there was a thing called the Peachy folder. And for older listeners out there, you're going to like smile right now. The Peachy folder. And you kept your notes in it, but so much time in class was spent doodling on top of the Peachy folders. And all I would do would be doodling my favorite band's logos. And maybe that's where I just fell in love with being a logo designer. But I think back then, it was done differently. And nowadays we don't really see that. And you look at mega superstars, okay, Taylor Swift, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Justin Timberlake, all these people. It became where every album became like a platform for artists to reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing, right? Because with artists, they have to have longevity.
Yeah, and I think it's like, okay, well, how does this relate to business? Well,
Yeah.
bands are created to make money. And if you haven't learned anything from Taylor Swift as of lately, is that bands can make a lot of money. And that's through merchandise, not so much the music nowadays of selling music, but the actual shows. But back then it was CD sales, record sales, all that. But I think when you do look at the band as a brand, it's like they are just like a business is subject to its industry or its market. A band is kind of subject to its genre. And it's an expectation that the audience is already going into. If it's a rock album, you know what you're going to be kind of stepping into. Then it's up to that, just like what Beatles, Bob Dylan, these other artists who added their twist to that genre, they came in and add their little flair, their twist, or like Kiss, they had their thematic brand kind of added their flair to it. And just like a brand, like we've said so many times, like that distinction is what makes those bands so special, whether it is even Taylor Swift now, it's like her changing per album and creating this entire like era of discography. It's actually created this really interesting distinction to her as an artist.
Especially when you got into merchandise. I mentioned Kiss earlier. They were the first bands to really kind of like what George Lucas did with Star Wars, where he knew he wasn't going to make his money on the film, ticket sales. It was in the merchandise. And Gene Simmons, the bassist for Kiss, was the master behind every piece of merchandising you could possibly think of. I went through about 3 different Kiss band lunchboxes in the 70s. And, they just took it on a whole nother level. And a lot of bands since then have tried to copy that, but especially in the 80s, particularly a lot of rock bands, whether it was Iron Maiden with their classic, word mark and their mascot, which was Eddie, this kind of ghoulish looking, freaky looking character who appeared in concept in every album. But again, they had a vibe, they had a lane, and they stuck to it, and it created this following and a connection.
These bands had very iconic visual systems that was then carried through the merchandising, like you said, the lunchboxes, all the shirts, all the album artwork, the posters. It created much more of a visual brand that when you think about it with music, it's like you don't really have that many, like the visual instances is very limited because it's music. And so it's either heard on the radio, so you need to have that visual representation out there, which maybe now you could say it's not as important because they can see you on social media, they can see the band on Apple Music or Spotify. They see these visual instances. But back then it was much more of like, hey, you got to have the merchandise be iconic and memorable, and the logo mark of these bands was probably much more weightier.
And I think too, and just as you're talking about it, brings to mind like why was that? Why is it that it was done differently maybe back then? Maybe now where you don't have that as much. And I know there's some bands are doing that, but everybody seems to every album kind of change tone, visual, and it's good that it keeps things fresh, right? That's how artists like Beyonce or even Justin Timberlake, everybody can go from a big band jazzy sounding album and then go out and put out something that's more grassroots and kind of mountain-esque, like I forget the name of it, this follow up, but
that one.
I think because a lot of, and I think back to the 70s and that whole music scene, is that when new bands were coming out on the scene, they had to start, they didn't get national exposure. It was local exposure, and it was done through gigs. So gig posters, flyers that so-and-so was going to be playing at Whiskey A Go-Go in LA. And so having an iconic band name that was graphic, that as they were lining up shows, it became an identifiable mark in print that people wouldn't go and go, oh, I heard about these guys, I'm going to go check them out. Back then, new music, the only way you got even people interested in buying your album, if you were lucky enough to get published, was airplay, radio. You go into a record store, you couldn't just crack any album and throw it on a demo vinyl player and pop in headphones and listen to it. You had to essentially have heard about him somehow, seen them at a show, or it was radio airplay. In the 80s, that all blew up because people weren't listening to radio as much, because in your cars and in walking around, you had the Sony Walkman, you had 8-track, you had cassette tapes, you had CDs, and then MTV introduced the music video, and that was the channel by which you could then now on a national level as a new band have a single get out there and get get people to get into it. Then you get into the internet, and now I could literally
listen to anything.
I can listen to anything. And so any local band, they can indie publish. They put together their own tracks and they upload it to Spotify, and they've got a presence. They may have 2 followers, but I guarantee if anybody goes down to a show or a club and they see, even a brewery, right? You see a band, you go, wow, and there they are. Oh, they've released 1 single. Okay, but then I can start following them, and as they drop new music, guess what? I'm being brought up to speed, or even AI and some of these are now making suggestions based on my listening types and my preferences. Yeah. So now new artists are being fed to me. And so it's a completely different playing field for bands hitting the music scene and marketing and branding themselves.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, like, on the business side, it is the adaptation. So just like genres are equivalent to like markets, right? And then the way your business is then delivering that offering, or how that offering is adapting, kind of like we talked about before, like the what or the how of the business, that's changing as the medium changes, as the vehicles of delivering is changing, just like Netflix changed from DVDs to streaming.
Yeah.
Or even, smaller businesses have had to change since 2020 with some of the different changes on pickup orders and all of that, and the expectation in the audience changing. But the why has carried through, just like on Apple. It's like the why is carried through from the computer to iPods to, now iPads and Vision Pro, just like Kiss's why has carried through the decades and decades of music, as things have changed from even how they make money as a band and a record label. The way money's generated has changed completely from music and merchandise to merchandise and experiences and concerts. And it's like, that to me is a massive shift where they really had to rethink everything and go, okay, what does the brand now mean to the audience? How do we redevelop that and start playing to that tune? Because like you said, it's like back in the day, like Beatles, they started off playing bar after bar after bar after bar until they were finally got enough people who knew about them and they finally blew up. And, now you had like Khalid, where he got the most streams on like Spotify of anyone, and that's what blew him up, was just stream by stream by stream, and it's all just little by little.
It's interesting too, like brought up Kiss again, and I don't want to focus the whole podcast on him, but here's a classic example of a band that is also embraces new technology. They're one of the first bands. They just had their final tour, literally, and they're retired. They're old enough that they within the last year, they went through a process of completely having them motion captured, digitally captured, their image, their persona, everything about them. They can carry on. How bands choose to embrace new technologies is great. But yeah, when we're talking about the visual branding of a band, that seemed to be a phase. I think it was like, for whatever reason, 1976, even the band ABBA, you look at the history of the ABBA logo with its reverse B, the shoulders touching reverse B and A, like that was not their very first logo. They came out earlier in the 70s, but had different iterations, but it was until 76. Again, that seems to be the magic year when all of a sudden all the band, it was like, it was popular. Everyone realized the value of that.
Yeah.
We talk about that fourth phase of brand, right? You go to know, to like, to love, to ownership. Taylor Swifties, right? The Swifties, like Michael Jackson's international throng of fans. Like, there's people, Beatlemania started it, but you take that obsession with a band to the next level, and the power that comes from that, and so in a microcosm in the music sector, well-branded brands are like, that's a bar for small businesses to go, wow, that's what you want. Any brand wants that, where you have, look at Apple again, what brand we're always talking up and probably bring up in every episode practically, but look at when they do when Apple has their big releases, right? There's diehards. Talk about groupies, right? There is an audience that pack it in and will drop. They'll do whatever it takes to get that first new Apple product, right? It goes beyond normal consumer and almost an obsession, right? And there's brands out there that do that.
There's identity to it, and I feel like that's where that ownership level of when someone is, that tied to a band or an artist, they feel that pride of it, and they resonate so well with it. And I think bands in particular, I see two major aspects of music is that one, it's intangible. The business itself is reliant on something that's so intangible that it's up to the listener to like it or not. And two, it's very emotional. There's really no logic to it. It's entertainment, but it's also extremely emotional. So when music resonates with someone, it really does resonate. And that's why music has been able to really change the world and change trends drastically. Music has had such control over that. And so those are the two foundational blocks of a brand is very emotional and that identity centric where someone just connects with it. And the intangible side of it makes it even that much more personal where it's okay, it's not about this, product that I'm holding or anything like that. It's actually I'm connected to not just a song, but also the artist who wrote it.
Yeah.
They are relating to me.
Yeah. I think one of the bands, more modern brands and I think this is what probably spurred this podcast, right? And it's a band you and I both love. We listen to a lot in the office, and you've been lucky enough to see them in concert. I have yet, and that's Sleep Token.
Yeah.
Where even the very fact that, I saw them just on social media drop, an announcement about, 5 more shows at the international and a couple new hey, we've dropped some more, and it was 18 rituals.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't even refer to their shows or concerts. It's rituals. And it's the idea of almost with Sleep Token, it's very almost we have joke, it's like a churches in session because it's this idea of almost like a religious ceremony, even though it's just all show and it's great, but and entertaining, right? It's very theatrical.
Yeah.
We even talked about how most of the time their shows are enclosed and it's very dark and subdued, and the lighting, everything. They put on such a tight technical show.
Yeah.
And one time I saw some videos, something where they actually had a headline or something, and it was an outdoor festival, and it was weird seeing their costumes and the makeup and the masks and everything in daylight. But there's where even they have a logo mark that is an obscure, unique mark that. You mentioned it was you saw it in someone's back window of a car, and you knew it immediately. There's a Sleep Token fan, and you felt an instant connection with the audience. Yeah,
what they've done so well is with some of these other bands, or even Kiss, they've captured this theme that then goes beyond their genre. So just like a business can capture a theme or a vibe that goes beyond their market, goes beyond their industry of what they're serving.
Goes beyond the service and product they're offering. Yeah.
Yeah. And even just In-N-Out selling, they sell hamburgers and fries, but the theme of In-N-Out, the vibe you get when you're in there, the cleanliness and just the tone of it.
It's Southern California.
Yeah.
So there's so many people that come out of before. I know In-N-Outs are now, a lot all over the place, but back, even 10 years ago when In-N-Out, the franchise was just based to Central and South, particularly SoCal.
Yeah.
Their vibe of the palm tree, the palm trees on their cups and the color scheme and everything. It was so California that when people would come to visit California, one of the things on their bucket list was to go to an In-N-Out. It became synonymous with California.
No, actually,
a burger franchise.
I just witnessed that. Is that I took my daughters to In-N-Out. It was last weekend or the weekend before, and there's these foreigners, and they're just speaking Russian or something. So it caught my attention, and I was like, oh, they're actually not speaking English. They sit down, and I'm watching them, not weirdly, but I'm just observing, and I see them. What looks like I see them take a lot of pictures of the burgers, and then when I see them bite into it, it's a husband and wife. It looks like, but I see their reactions, and I could tell it was their first In-N-Out experience. Yeah, and I could tell they came, and it was
anticipated.
It's just the way they set up there. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually seeing these people enjoy In-N-Out for the first time. And they were taking pictures, and she did a thumbs up to her husband. And she was so it was so amazing to see. I'm like, it's a burger and French fry. It's if commodities of a burger and French fries. And it's something special. But it's even with Sleep Token or any of these bands where they set up, even what Taylor Swift's done, where it's you create this theme and this drama behind the band and the brand, where people are so invested in it, where it's part of the experience, it's part of the ritual, it's part of this this identity that you're
right.
part
I mean, I'm not really. I'm not a Taylor Swift fan. I know you've got girls, so you probably have
by proxy.
Okay, so
I have to be.
Yes, you're a Taylor Swift by proxy as a dad with outnumbered in the household with females. But like, there's a thing with bracelets, isn't it? With Swifties,
That was like,
right? Like,
yeah, I didn't find out about this until the girls
like if
had
you're
a bunch
going
of
to a
friends
Taylor
over.
Swift concert, even a Taylor Swift viewing, right in the theater, which she had.
They're
earlier
all
this
making
year.
bracelets in her kitchen. I'm like, what's going on? There's beads everywhere. And apparently it's a thing where when you go see Taylor Swift concerts or an event, you make these bracelets, and it's just like the little letters that you get from Michaels.
Okay.
And colored beads, but you make them, and then when you're there, I think you trade them or something like that. So it says like bestie or love, or it says a lyric from the song, and you trade it with other girls.
Right. Now, here's the question I have. Was that something engineered by Taylor Swift? Or is it something that someone started to do and it caught on? Yeah. In other words, was it consumer, right, audience, but a consumer-based initiative out of fandom versus Taylor Swift or her publisher or whoever devises them going, hey, we're going to start this. It's going to go huge. It's going to blow up with the audience, and this is what we're going to do. Yeah. I don't know. It'd be something to interest in. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people that are listening that maybe know a lot more about Taylor Swift and have the answer. But again, when a brand can have the audience take over and not in a destructive way to the brand, but in a way that continues to propel the brand and fuels it. Yeah. That is ultimately what any business brand wants to arrive at. That's your gold mark, a standard, because now how much effort do you have to do in marketing and getting whatever it is the next thing that you're going to do as a brand, whether it's a new service, you're going to tweak your offering, you're going to offer something new. Maybe you're branching into a whole new other sector, right? You've got your audience, your fan base that are diehard loyalists. They are going to promote that for you.
Yeah. And be like part of it because the identity, just like any identity, it shifts. Even this, it makes me even think of where you see in markets where businesses, even like Domino's, when they started acting more like a tech company and not like a normal pizza standard pizza delivery company and pizza making, they actually had much more involved of going, okay, we're making this more tech focused, it's delivery. So you started seeing this blurring of the lines between industries. Yeah. And I feel like that's what you see even in music now, is whether the artist is changing their genre and they're changing the identity based off of their...
Didn't Beyonce just come out with a country single or something?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And two really successful artists is that I think 21 Pilots was on the edge of this. Khalid was definitely on the edge of this, but I think 21 Pilots, they did this really well where they started almost mix and matching these genres where the song would have this pop punk and then go into almost like rap and hip hop and then almost like slow. Sleep Token does that, where you have this mixing and matching of genres. And to me, that's like really what you see with industries where even in markets where businesses are having to adapt and start introducing these really interesting techniques or methods from other industries.
Yeah. Another example that came to mind was in the 90s, the pop rock band Hootie and the Blowfish, their lead singer Darius Rucker, after the band broke up, he transitioned into the country market and really took off. I mean, he's gotten a couple Grammys and stuff in that category of country music. And Darius Rucker's making a name for himself, but he transitioned completely, skipped over to for out of the more the mainstream rock 90s rock lane into country music and is doing really well.
Again, like the why has stayed the same of the artists and the brand itself, but the what and how, the industry, the genre, that's changing. And I think as technology advances, you are getting these blurred lines between industries on the business side, and in the music world, you're getting these blurred genres. Or someone who's completely, like Beyonce, skipping to a totally different genre, or what was that? Lovato, she jumped into
Demi Lovato, to rock, from pop
and
to
Taylor
rock.
Swift changing, and it's like you're seeing this. Justin Timberlake did it, and that's where I'm like, I think technology is having this weird flux on categories and how we actually define those, and it's allowing artists and businesses to be able to start playing with that and creating now these hybrids that are much more effective.
Yeah.
But again, going back to the brand of it, the brand is what's carrying them through that. So as a business, as you're evolving and changing and adapting to what your audience is wanting, you're able to actually do that. And your brand, your why, and your promise in the core of it, that's going to help you evolve with that and take your audience along for the ride. And they're going to keep supporting you and going along with you because they have that identity with you.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So I think, again, and you looking back at how with bands and branding and how they've gotten their message out there and connect with their audience, they all have the same thing. Is that there's clarity for what they stand for. They build a base, a fan base. They nurture that fan base. They empower that fan base to do the work, much of the work for them. But there is room, and there's time calls to reinvent themselves, and that's useful as well. I think it's as long as there's clarity, which is we preach from the mountaintops about branding, is that you need to be clear in who you are, what you stand for, who you're trying to reach.
Yeah, who's your listener, who's your audience.
Exactly, and that may change from season to season, but if you're trying to be, no band ever puts music out there trying to appeal to all ages, all genres, right? You can't do it. And same thing with your business, your product or service, your brand. You can't be the end all to everybody. You have to focus, figure out who it is you're trying to reach, and you do that through the power of brand.
Yeah.
So, crank it to 11, and a little Spinal Tap reference there, but. Anyway, hey guys, thanks for checking in, and hope you enjoyed this little more lighthearted conversation on music and branding. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.